I want to thank Eric very much. I came in last night, and Eric has been very diligent in being a good host. We did a nice tour of the campus. Wow, you guys work in such a beautiful setting. I had not been on the campus before. It's really impressive, and I envy you, your facilities here and the surroundings. It's absolutely gorgeous. I'm pleased and honored to be here to talk to you about online learning today. We're going to be talking about what does the research tell us, and I want to get started with a quick caveat. I've been working in this area doing research in online learning for more than 2 decades now, and frequently you see the question from people who are kind of new to this, is online learning as good as classroom instruction? The answer is just, let's get out of the way. Yes, it's as good as classroom instruction. We know it is. There are 15 meta-analyses that summarize thousands and thousands of studies, and they all result in pretty much the same conclusion. There's a no significant difference phenomenon in the world of online learning. It's a design issue, right? We can design instruction to be very bad in the classroom. We can design instruction to be very good in the classroom. We can design instruction to be very bad online. We can design instruction to be very good online. And some of the more recent meta-analytic evidence suggests that things are getting better and better online. So we'll talk about that when we get a little bit farther along. I wanted to be a little bit more forward-thinking today and talk about some issues that probably people have been aware of and might be more interested in than me diving deeply into meta-analytic evidence, although I'm sure some meta-analysts here might find that interesting. But I'm going to be talking about some sources that are informing my recent thinking about what are important issues that confront us in the world of teaching and learning and higher education and online learning as well. And some of those have to do with automation and artificial intelligence. So I've been recently reading books like The Rise of the Robots, Nicholas Carr's work, The Glass Cage, Automation and Us, The Second Machine Age by Eric Bernjolson and his colleague Andrew McAfee at MIT. And just very recently, this new book by the president of Northwestern, Joseph Allen, called Robot Proof. So a lot of these are sort of in the same genre of narrative about how are things changing, how do we need to respond to changes in the worlds of automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning, and helping us understand those issues relative to higher education. Let's do a quick quiz. Who knows who this guy is? Turing? Good. No, a little bit more obscure. His name is Arthur Samuels. He's considered the father of data-intensive algorithms and machine learning. And this picture is showing him writing the first program to have a program beat him at chess. Right? So he wrote this program that allowed him to be beaten at chess. And we've seen these kinds of developments. This is checkers, yeah, sorry, checkers, right. We've seen these happen later with chess, with Deep Blue and other programs that can do these kinds of things. And it's sort of a curious question, writing programs that can do things better than you can do, and it raises some interesting issues. So computers can learn, right? They can be taught to beat us at checkers, they can be taught to beat us at chess, and there are certainly new things that computers can do and computation can do and technology can do that they couldn't be done in the past. So these are some of the new things that computers can do: reading and writing, looking at things, speaking and listening, integrating knowledge, driving cars, preparing food, diagnosing medical conditions. It's a surprising list, right? Everybody's familiar with this scenario in which you have Watson competing against people in Jeopardy and beating them, which led Ken to say, "I, for one, welcome our new computer overlords," as everybody recalls. So we're starting to see some changes, some pretty dramatic changes, and we're kind of all familiar with some of these newer changes. We have things like self-driving cars that drive as well as human beings do. Google cars have driven more than 2 million miles on roads in California and Nevada, and there have been very, very few incidents or accidents. The one that's commonly referred to is the car getting into an accident with a driver in it. The car was actually being driven by a person, and having a problem. And there are also problems with encountering other drivers, because drivers don't act like computers. They'll vie for advantage at intersections in ways computers are not programmed to do. So it's what do you do with these humans? They're such a nagging, persistent problem when you have this kind of stuff going on. So computers can see as well. So this whole vision technologies for computers are changing things pretty dramatically. Software that matches faces almost as well as you do. The new Facebook technology was a couple of years ago, can recognize faces only 0.25% less accurately than a human being can, and I'm sure that's actually come down in recent years. So computers can recognize faces. So computers can also do things like writing, right? This was a quiz that appeared in the New York Times a while ago. Did a computer write this? And then they give you a couple of different stories. And lo and behold, yeah, this story in the New York Times was not written by a human being, it was written by a computer algorithm, right? That's happened in things like natural disasters. Here's another sports example. Tuesday was a great day for Roberts, his junior pitcher, threw a perfect game. This was reviewed by some folks at a website called Deadspin, and they read an account of the game by a human and an account of the game by a computer, and they said the computer's rendering of the game was much more interesting and well summarized than the human being had done. So some interesting stuff. That technology was developed by a company called Quill, and they sell the technology to write stories for people in all kinds of industries. Computers can speak and listen, right? And lately they've been doing more than speaking and listening. They've been doing things like translating on the fly. This is an image of a Microsoft researcher at a conference in China where he is speaking, and as he's speaking, his voice is being translated automatically into English text, and then automatically from English text to Chinese text, and then automatically from Chinese text to spoken Chinese. This on the fly without any translator in the room. So it's some pretty dramatic and remarkable changes that we're seeing with the advent of these new technologies. And they're not limited to just one area. They're cutting across different industries, core technologies, and different kinds of enterprises, a broad domain of different industries where machine learning and artificial intelligence are having profound effects. And I don't know, how many people have seen this one? Sophia. Not very many people. Sophia is a new robotic technology that's making the rounds on late night television, was actually interviewed by a New York Times reporter in Abu Dhabi, I think it was made a citizen of Saudi Arabia as a result of this interaction at a conference in which the New York Times reporter interviewed her. Some pretty dramatic and rapid changes. I don't know if you see this, it's actually quite creepy, but she has emotional responses that are appropriate to most of the conversation, but not all of it. So it's kind of an interesting development. So the concern is we're seeing dramatic changes in computer performance and relatively linear changes in human performance. And the fears, some of the fears you've seen, take it or leave it, come from folks like Elon Musk and Stephen Hawking saying, hey, this stuff, potentially artificial intelligence is an existential threat. Terminator scenarios, you've seen it all. Okay, but leaving that aside for the moment, right? Computers are doing things that humans used to do, right? They do things like drive cars, prepare food, diagnose diseases, find legal precedents. And Eric Bernjolson and other, David McKay, the economists at MIT, are talking about things like the decoupling of productivity from private sector employment. And they've tracked productivity in private sector employment over the course of many years and are saying somewhere around the rise of the digital age, we're starting to see productivity continue to go up and private sector employment kind of leveling off. And the trend seems to suggest something like economic displacement, right? They also say that the digital age is digital, exponential, and combinatorial, and that will provide opportunities for new kinds of collaborations, new kinds of partnerships, new kinds of employment. Maybe. They also hedge their bets and say maybe we should have government policies that anticipate a jobless future. But not online learning, right? This isn't happening in the world of online learning. We're safe, right? I don't know if folks remember Sebastian Thrun. You remember Sebastian Thrun? He was a member at Stanford University. They taught one of the first massive open online courses, 150,000 students, spun it off into a successful company called Udacity. And this is one of the quotes from Sebastian about Udacity. My response to the development of AI, the mission I have to educate everybody, is really an attempt to delay what AI will eventually do to us, because I honestly think people should have a chance, right? So there have been some concerns voiced about AI and replacement, and it raises interesting questions about the role of computers and machines relative to humans, and how do we confront those, not just in, the standard industries where it's been a concern, like manufacturing, but obviously in white collar and increasingly potentially in higher education and education more broadly. So Rise of the Robots is one of the works that talks a little bit about, okay, what are the particular kinds of abilities that humans have that machines don't seem to have, and we don't really anticipate they'll be getting anytime soon? And how does it relate to humans? So one way to think about it is what humans do and what learning is about. And learning is sort of a very complex phenomenon, right? There's a cognitive dimension, there are social dimensions, there's psychological and developmental dimensions, there are affective and emotional, interpersonal and motivational dimensions. And most of these are dimensions where human beings seem to have particular kinds of advantages over machines. And Byrne-Jolson and McKay talk about, in their book, The Second Machine Age, about racing with rather than against machines, and the use of technologies in support of human capacities rather than in competition with machine capacities. So I talk about racing with machines and not against them. And I think it got me thinking, okay, so how does this relate to what we do in teaching and learning every day? And it brings up things like Bloom's taxonomy, right? If we think about what things like Google and search engines and other forms of technology are good at, they tend to be better at the lower end of Bloom's taxonomy. Things like remembering, and artificial intelligence is increasingly good at, in some ways, understanding. And there may be some dimensions of application, but at the higher levels, people still have a much greater advantage in supporting, creating, evaluating, and analyzing, I think. So the good news is we still have advantages in supporting the more important dimensions of learning, the higher dimensions of learning at the top end of Bloom's taxonomy. There are other ways to think about the effects of automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning on human beings in higher education. And Joseph Allen, who's the president of Northeastern University, talks about a new field that he thinks we should be developing. I work in a department called Informatics. He's saying we should have a department called Humanics, right? And Humanics would create a certain kind of curriculum that make people robot-proof. This curriculum provides students with 3 literacies: technical literacy, data literacy, and human literacy, such as teamwork, entrepreneurship, creativity, ethics, and cultural agility. And these, he argues, are abilities that machines do not have and very likely will never have. So we should be working on things where human beings have advantages over machines. Okay. But how about in our individual practice? What can we be doing with this, armed with this information? I think there are opportunities for sort of blindly adopting technologies, and there are opportunities for thinking and reflecting much more clearly about what we value and what we gain and what we give up through reliance on automation and things like artificial intelligence. I don't think we should be accepting automation blindly, and we should be thinking about our own practice and being reflective about those things. So humanic or humanistic values for learning reflect these sorts of conditions. Communities reflect values, and there are different kinds of values that we can espouse. We can espouse instrumental values or generative values. So an example of an instrumental value is one that we're increasingly seeing in higher education is I'm going to college so I can get a job, so I can make money, so I can be okay financially. There's some thinking that new motivation, and this is in research that's been done by Twenge, is the source of a lot of the outbreak of anxiety and depression among college students as they are increasingly ill-suited to the values of learning as generative values, values of learning for purposes of individual and intellectual growth or development. And their more extrinsic or instrumental value for higher education is causing a lot of the concerns and a lot of the struggles that students seem to be having. So we can learn, we can help students develop things like develop their own voices, help teach them to think, help them to grow or contribute. And those values are more generative than values such as get me a job, which seems to be on the rise according to Twenge and her colleague. When you look at the influence of automation on values, one of the things I think is particularly dangerous is the use of automation in terms of assessment and the use of automation for assessment. Automation is particularly good at certain kinds of assessment, but in that equation, there's a value that's reflected. Only certain things can be automated, not everything can be automated. And we begin to automate assessment, we are making statements about what we value in teaching and learning. And the downside is that we give privilege to kinds of knowledge and the types of activities that are most easily evaluated and assessed through automation, and lose some of the perspective on what might be more valuable and what we may value. This is Mitch Resnick from the MIT Media Lab talking about some of the potential downsides of automating teaching and learning and its effects. How many folks know Mitch Resnick, have heard of Mitch Resnick? Absolutely, a couple of people, yeah. He's the director of the MIT Media Lab, and have folks ever heard of the program Scratch? It's a program used for kids to learn computer programming, and it was conceived of in the MIT Media Lab. The goal of using Scratch is not only to teach kids computing, but also to help to generate certain kinds of values among kids who use it. So the idea is that we can use technologies to foster particular kinds of human abilities, one of which is empathy and sharing and collaboration. So Resnick talks about the kinds of skills that participation in the Scratch community supports, and it's things like, skills, strategies, and values. Skills like being able to divide computer problems into simpler parts or iteratively refine designs. He talks about strategies like problem solving and communicating complex or abstract ideas. But more importantly, the participation in the Scratch online community is about sharing and giving credit and collaboration and perseverance. And this idea of deploying technologies in ways that support particular kinds of human values is at a higher level in his estimation, which I think in a lot of ways situates human beings where they have particular strengths. We also have to think about empathy. For millions of years of evolution have hardwired human beings to be empathic. We can't help it. Our students value empathy, and online education should prioritize empathic teaching. So this, I think, is supported by work. I don't know if folks are familiar with researchers named George Siemens. He's at the University of Texas, Arlington now, used to be at Athabasca. And he's had particular concerns about some of the newer technologies that are being deployed and how they situate human beings. You know, the question is, does the technology foster creativity and personal expression? Does it develop the learner and contribute to her formation as a person? Does it have the human teacher or peer learners at the center? Does it consider the whole learner? Is the technology fun and engaging? And if the answers to these questions are no, we should be really thinking hard about why we're adopting the technology. What are we doing with it? What problem is it going to solve? I think particularly helpful when we think about what is our particular role in teaching and learning in the age of automation. Another thing you can think about is what do we do individually? What can we do in light of the rise of abilities of machines and technologies? Some recent research done by the Gallup Purdue Index, I think, provides particular useful insights. These are the kinds of things that you as an online instructor can do that will have some profound effects on students. So be an online professor who makes students excited about learning, cares about students as people, encourages students to pursue their goals, assigns long-term projects, encourages jobs or internships or extracurricular activities. And the question is why? Why does that matter? It matters because the outcomes of students who experience that have these kinds of experiences in higher education are so much better than those when students don't experience those activities in higher education. So students who experience one of those big six ideas or big six sorts of approaches to teaching and learning are more likely to graduate on time, be engaged at work, thrive in different elements of well-being, and strongly agree to feeling prepared after college. So you see the number of students who experience all six of these is relatively limited, but for each increase in the experience of these six, you have increasing success within four-year graduation time, increasing success at being engaged at work, increasing success at thriving at all five elements of well-being that were measured, and increasing feelings of being prepared for life. So those are sorts of values that I think we as online educators can focus on when we start to think about the uses of technology for teaching and learning. So what does the evidence from research on online teaching and learning tell us about what we should do with online learning to make it better than classroom instruction according to the literature, and how do we leverage our human qualities? So as I mentioned early in the discussion, that there's a great deal of meta-analytic evidence. Again, Bob Bernard at Concordia University has reviewed 15 different meta-analyses with literally thousands and thousands of studies to come to the conclusion that online learning can be just as good as classroom-based instruction on all of the outcome measures that have been set in all of these different studies. And again, it's an issue of design. So the question becomes, what do we do with the time? What do we do with the opportunities that online learning affords us? How do we design instruction? What do we focus on? What do we emphasize? One of the best pieces of research in the literature, the meta-analytic research, is an article that appeared by Shea and his colleagues a few years back. It was actually 2005 in Teachers College Record, where the question was, what makes a difference, right? So there's a great deal of variance in these studies. Some studies finding online learning or distance education to be better. Some studies finding online learning or distance education to be worse. What are the conditions under which online learning is better? What are those? Those are the studies we want to focus on. We want to find the conditions under which students excelled in online learning relative to the classroom. So this meta-analytic evidence, one of the questions that were investigated and one in multiple meta-analyses is publication year. And you think, well, what difference does that make, what year the studies were done? It's one of the biggest and most significant effects is when the studies were published. And the watershed year appears to be 1998. And does anybody remember what happened in 1998 with regard to online learning? It's a long time ago. We were working on it back then, but not everybody was. 1998 is the year that the learning management system was developed and begun to be deployed on campuses and allowed suddenly for scalable two-way interaction, computer-mediated interaction. And you see that across all these different kinds of learning management systems, they just got more, adoption of those became greater and greater and more broad as time progresses. And so what this tells us, I think, is that starting in 1998, the two-way interaction that's afforded by institutionally supported learning management systems has an effect on the quality of distance education. Before that, distance education was largely carried out with very scattered technological means, or even through the post office and through the mail. But the rise of the learning management system allows for two-way kinds of interaction between both faculty and faculty, student to student. And that's supported by results from the meta-analyses. Instructor involvement was the most significant moderator among all identified factors. Where instructor involvement is low, the effect size is negative. Where instructor involvement is medium, the effect size is high. Whereas effect size is, where the instructor involvement is high, it's slightly lower, but still better than low. So there's a balancing act in here where we want instructors to be involved and interacting with students and being mindful of students, engaging in empathic sorts of activities, doing sort of the big six kinds of ideas that result in better outcomes. But we don't want instructors overdoing it. We don't want instructors' involvement in things like discussion to be so heavy-handed that it squashes or limits the kind of interactions that students might otherwise engage in. So I think that's one of the big ones. So the studies of interaction find, generally speaking, that higher levels of student content, student-faculty interaction results in better outcomes. Mostly human interaction, right? Leaving students to their own devices and standalone courses doesn't necessarily have the best effects. Meta-analytic evidence supports this. So you can see the numbers of studies by the kinds of interaction that they were primarily focused on. Student-student interaction, student-instructor interaction, student content interaction, they're all relatively good. The difference is when students are given the means to communicate with each other, interact with one another, or online with content, and increase in achievement and result. These findings, again, these are strong for both online learning and blended learning. What's not particularly effective is having students engaged in self-study in online courses. Students in both collaborative, interactive learning and teacher-directed expository instruction significantly outperform students who are left in self-study situations, self-study contexts. So I think the important, principle to take away from this is that we can give students access to computer technologies where the computer does all the teaching and the student interacts primarily with the computer, or we can create environments where there's interaction between students and faculty and students and content, And we know from decades of research that the human interaction is more effective than just content interaction or self-study, study alone with a program. There's also principles that come out of the meta-analytic about effective blending, focusing on self-regulation, focusing on motivational designs, and focusing on collaborative and cooperative learning designs all have positive outcomes. So focusing on students' forethought and planning, their monitoring, and their reflection on their performance, that sort of self-regulatory cycle that Zimmerman talks about has an effect, a positive effect on student outcomes in online learning. Focusing on motivation also has a positive effect. And working with students, designing courses that promote cooperative and collaborative learning also has a positive effect relative to other kinds of designs. So what do we know about online learning from these 15 meta-analyses? If you're going to boil it all down, I would boil it all down to these principles. To make online learning better than typical classroom-based instruction, we're aligning assessment with instruction, promoting student-to-student and student-to-teacher interaction, working on building a sense of learning community, supporting self-regulated learning, replacing lectures with more active learning materials, and letting faculty know about learner status and progress and risks through technologies, and identifying big picture goals and the big ideas in the discipline. These are all approaches that result in higher levels of learning in online environments versus classroom environments. So these are sort of the areas that show the most promise for getting students to outperform classroom-only instruction. And this applies both in online and blended settings. So understanding that these are the big opportunities allows for deeper discussions of how do we do this? How do we make sure that we're aligning instruction and assessment? What are the kind of designs that promote effective interaction between students and student faculty? What are the kinds of designs that help build a learning community? And how do we define learning community? How do we support self-regulated learning? These are all questions that I'm going to sort of push on you guys today. And some of these are more intuitive, replacing lectures with more active activities. And in using the technology to inform faculty about learner progress. But all of these represent the greatest area of opportunity for making online learning better than classroom instruction, according to the meta-analytic literature. So I think I'm going to stop there and let people ask some questions or take some comments or questions. And thank you very much for your time. Raphaela.
Question right away. That last list is really a very interesting one, but I would argue it's also the same list to make
Instruction in the classroom and better than, yeah, yeah,
I know,
yeah.
you know, it's one of the very things.
Yes,
that, you
yeah.
know, principals oftentimes cut across, but I wonder if anyone had done a study about the face-to-face classes, because it would be a nice application.
Yeah, I think there's been a tremendous amount of educational research on face-to-face instruction, and I think that there's a talk about effect sizes, and there's a meta-analysis of meta-analyses that looks at what are the most important interventions, what kind of interventions are most likely to have effects that improve learning, that improve student outcomes. And the big one, of course, is feedback, right? Providing feedback to students, letting them know how they're doing is critical to improving instruction. It's also critical in the online classroom. We've done research with literally thousands of students across SUNY where we've asked students whether they're satisfied or unsatisfied, whether they thought they were learning or they were not learning. And we asked dozens of questions. And one of the most important correlates of whether students feel satisfied or whether they feel they're learning is, are they interacting? Are they interacting with the instructor? Are they interacting with other students? and where they're not getting that, where they feel that the instructor is not providing effective feedback, you're guaranteed to have students who are unhappy. We also looked through thousands of comments from students across SUNY for decades, and some of the responses that really rise to the surface is when students are reporting about faculty going missing and faculty not responding in a timely way. So we know that this human interaction, this support of students through feedback is critical for both the classroom and an online setting. So yeah, absolutely.
Just kidding. We have a copy of your slideshow, just so like a bunch of librarians here, we want to make sure we have the books that you mentioned.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, the whole session is obviously being recorded,
Yeah.
so you'll have.
But
We make those, it takes a week or two to get them posted, but they'll be up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So then you can watch this over and over.
Other questions?
Yeah, what you made the conclusion that when you improve the interaction, the learning outcome becomes better. How do you assess the learning outcome? Based on the scores or satisfaction mix?
For the meta-analytic evidence uses a variety of outcome measures. Frequently, it will be a comparison of one group on tests or classroom-based scores. So the meta-analytic evidence about the use of interaction to improve instruction is based on data where students are doing either particular kinds of assignments or for the entire course grade, for example. Some of our research, and we've done research for decades, some of it's been survey-based, some of it's been analyzing evidence from large databases collected by the Department of Education. Some of it's been working at the course level with student postings. But the preponderance of that evidence has to do with survey research and just basically asking students lots and lots of questions and determining under what conditions are students satisfied with the online experience, under what conditions do students report high levels of learning. And one of the most common or highest level correlations has to do with whether they're getting feedback, whether they're experiencing interaction. Students tend to value interaction with the instructor more highly than they value it with other students. So I think the idea that we're going to be replacing faculty anytime soon with automation is not going to work well for students' experiences in online courses. We looked at asking like parallel sets of questions. Did you have high levels of interaction with your classmates? Did you have high levels of interaction with your instructor? And then we looked at outcomes like reported learning and like student satisfaction. And the correlations were about twice as high for the instructor condition. So students really value the interaction with instructor very highly as it relates to how they feel they're learning and whether they're feeling satisfied with the experience in general.
And is there any difference between the basic class and advanced?
Sorry again?
Is there any difference between the basic level class and the advanced level?
The meta-analytic evidence that I've looked at, I think, which would be much more reliable, doesn't identify the course level as one of the mediators in terms of outcomes in performance. So I think that good courses can be designed online at a basic level, and good courses can be designed online at an advanced level. And again, it comes back to a design issue, I think.
Yeah, I was just interested in how you had broken down the definition of teacher interaction beyond feedback and course design, because I'm interested in the narrative, the teacher narrative throughout the course design, personality of the teacher in relation to the students, and as different than how a teacher personality and a narrative is perceived in a regular face-to-face classroom.
So in a way, what I hear you talking about is how do faculty establish this presence online in the absence of face-to-face interaction. So you've got faculty who are very adept at teaching in classrooms, and they can create a sense of presence through the moment-by-moment negotiation of meaning that happens on the fly in a face-to-face setting. And how is that, how does that happen in online settings? Yeah, we actually did quite a bit of research trying to understand what are the components of the online experience that result in not only a sense of better learning, but also in a sense of being there. This being there is a concept that's frequently referred to as social presence. How do people project themselves as real people into the online environment in ways that are satisfying and feel resonant with them? But also, how do people learn in online environments where they're at the higher levels of Bloom's taxonomy, where they feel like they're making connections and they're able to apply what they're learning? And what we found was there's a strong predictive element when we look at the notion of teaching presence, and that's our faculty engaged in instructional design, facilitation of discourse, and direct instruction in ways that you can further articulate. Do they project themselves as real people? Are they engaged in the kinds of activities where they're sharing with the class themselves as human beings? And you can measure that through this social presence construct. And what do we use? And when we use that to predict outcomes in what's been called cognitive presence, or the sort of cyclical dimension of connecting with other students and feeling like you're learning at high levels, feeling like you can apply what you're learning, feeling like you're connecting. We find that there's a strong predictive element. You can predict most of the variance in students' cognitive presence by whether the students are rating instructors strongly on teaching presence and social presence. So we know from large-scale survey research on those questions that you can get to high levels of cognitive presence, higher levels on Bloom's taxonomy, when you're encouraging faculty to understand facilitation of discourse, provision of direct instruction, and instructional design and organization that is appropriate to the environment. Other questions?
The ability for professors to teach whatever their topic is, and then the ability to use the technologies to have really good online learning courses, I would have to believe in some cases to be very different skill sets. So are there instances where you have somebody who is the more of the expert on the online learning environment who pairs with the professors to help them to deliver these experiences? Yeah,
I mean, it's crucial that you provide support to faculty, and faculty development for online learning is essential, I think. It's not an impossible mystery to penetrate, but the opportunity to actually sit down and design a course and experience instruction within a course, and to go back and reflect on how did this course go in partnership or with the support of an instructional designer, for example, or some other support professional, I think is critical. I think that offering those kinds of opportunities to partner with someone, and again, it's not rocket science, but it's also not something that people just come to and say, I can do this. Typically, courses without instructional design tend to suffer in a couple of different ways. There's an instructional design and organization component that doesn't happen in an orderly fashion. Facilitation of discourse might be played down and not highlighted in ways that's more beneficial. So yeah, I think it's critical to have that kind of support. There's another question?
I'm asking two questions related to the research perspective. One is when you're talking about online learning, so it's more like in a formal university environment, right? So how do you perceive MOOC, that kind of learning also in the realm of online education? And that's my first question.
Okay.
And second question is, what do you perceive as the biggest issue in online learning in terms of research?
Okay, on the MOOC question, I think there's different metaphors for learning. So one metaphor for learning is acquisition, that how I learn is sort of what I can acquire and what can go into my head. And another metaphor for learning is participation, and how can I be an effective participant in a community of learning, and how do I document or demonstrate my increasing abilities within this community of learning. I think the metaphor of acquisition applies more to MOOC settings, where there's a great deal of content, usually video-based content, and students and the designs of those courses tend to foreground content acquisition. And you see tremendously high rates of, diminishing participation in MOOCs, and I think that's related to some of the results we've seen about analytical evidence in online learning, where students who are left to self-study tend to underperform students who are engaged in human interaction with instructors and with other students. So that sort of acquisition metaphor, I think, reflects course designs in MOOC settings that are meant to scale to very large numbers of students. I think that participation metaphor applies more to formal learning environments, where our goal is to try to sort of provide almost cognitive apprenticeships for students in what is the material, what's important in this discipline, how can I introduce people to the important elements of the discipline. So this, I think, understanding what metaphor underlines our perspective on teaching and learning helps us understand these different environments, the MOOC environment and the formal, more small-scale online learning that happens typically in formal higher education environments. What was the second question?
Second question is, what did you see the biggest issue in the research of online learning?
Right now, my own work focuses on for whom is online learning an advantageous situation, and for whom does it represent particular kinds of challenges. So we just published, we just had a paper accepted in the International Review of Research in Open Distance Learning on something that we're calling the community college paradox. So there's been a great deal of very rigorous research done at the state level by the Community College Research Center at Teachers College, Columbia University, by Shauna Smith-Jaggers and her colleagues there, and by folks at the California Public Research Interest Group. It's Hans Johnson. They did statewide studies in California. Shauna's done statewide studies in Virginia and Washington. And they've been, especially with community college students who may be new to higher education, for whom higher education is sort of a new culture. Their parents may not have gone to college. There are outcomes, course level outcomes, that are particularly concerning. So students tend to have lower grades, they tend to fail more, they tend to be less likely to return the next semester in online settings relative to their classroom courses. This is stuff that were found in Virginia and Washington. But at the program level, they tend to do better. So students who mix online and classroom instruction tend to have higher graduation rates and faster time to degree. We found that at the national level using U.S. Department of Education data from the beginning post-secondary student survey. We looked across 7 years of data and found students who mixed online and classroom instruction early on in their career were more likely to have a degree by the end of their observation period. They found the same thing in California, across all the California community colleges, that students who were mixing online and classroom instruction were having better program level outcomes. I think what's particularly of interest is to understand who is advantaged and who is disadvantaged by participation in online settings. So I think that's an area where there's a lot more opportunity. I think especially at the community college level, and especially for students who qualify for remedial education, we need to be very mindful that an online setting may or may not be appropriate. And if it's not appropriate, we need to be thinking about what kinds of supports do we need to offer students that are going to make the two environments equivalent again, because there may be need for additional student support. I don't think student support in online settings has been around long enough to be comparable to student support in online and classroom environments. And I think there's a lot more we could do for student support, especially for students in community colleges, especially for students who qualify for remedial education. Other questions? No? All right, I want to thank everybody once again. I want to thank you, Eric.